Connections Radio presents
Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. And on this new edition of Vegas Hockey Hub, we are going to be discussing defenseman Kaedan Korczak. And we're going to be looking at a past season for Kaedan Korczak and discussing if he is truly ready to be a full-time member of the VGK after he split the AHL and NHL this past year. So this is going to be a very fun episode. Really looking forward to doing this. And in a way, it is a follow-up to our player profile we did on Kaedan Korczak last season. So last year, around 2022, we did upload a player profile discussing Kaedan Korczak when he was a prospect for the Vegas Golden Knights. So this is a follow-up to that, and just really discussing and really getting into the fact that is Kaedan Korczak truly ready to be a full-time member of your Vegas Golden Knights for this upcoming season. So let's get into it. Now, for a quick summary of what Kaedan Korczak has done up into this upcoming season. Now, with Kaedan Korczak, he was a second-round pick in 2019 by your Vegas Golden Knights. And Kaedan Korczak has had an interesting tenure with the Golden Knights organization up to this point. Now, when it comes to Kaedan Korczak in 2020, 2021, he made his first starts in the AHL with the Henderson Silver Knights. And then 2021, 2022, he played a majority of the season in the AHL in Henderson and then had a one-game start. His first ever start in the NHL would be in the 2021-2022 season with the Vegas Golden Knights, but he played 48 games in total when you combine the two. And then the past season for Kaedan Korczak, and the reason why he was on my radar for season one of Vegas Hockey Hub, was that he played in 50 AHL games for the Henderson Silver Knights and put up respectable numbers in that season with Henderson. And then he had a 10-game stint with the Vegas Golden Knights, and that was really one of his first actual chances to be in the starting lineup for the Vegas Golden Knights. And at age 21, Kaedan Korczak, was really kind of, building himself up, getting into his age 22 season. And what was fascinating about Kaedan Korczak is that at 22 years old, heading into the year, 11 games in the NHL, but he played over 100 games in the AHL up to this season. And it was really interesting to see if he was going to make the opening day roster for the Vegas Golden Knights or if he was going to be with Henderson. But, going through training camp, going through preseason, he was in, a decent amount of preseason games on the defensive side for Vegas. And, very interesting to see what would happen with Kaedan Korczak as the season would get ready to kick off in this past year. And what I do want to mention when it comes to Kaedan Korczak is that this is a guy who, like I mentioned before, age 22, he's had 3 full seasons of AHL experience and just a little under a dozen games in the NHL up to that point. But he was really making an impact and really building himself up as a future member of the Vegas Golden Knights after the preseason with Vegas. So it was fascinating when the opening night roster came out for the Vegas Golden Knights and they did the banner celebration and everything. Kaedan Korczak would be really the last man to get cut. And what I mean cut is that you're no longer on the NHL roster and you would be sent down to the AHL. And, Kaedan Korczak, that would be, the day before opening night. And with him being, sent down to Henderson, being part of that situation, he would then, not even 2 games into the NHL season, he would get immediately called up and would be promoted from Henderson to Vegas. and he would play in 6 of the first 10 games this year. And Kaedan Korczak even had his first career goal in his second game of the season. That would be against Dallas earlier in October. And what's fascinating is that if you actually look at Kaedan Korczak, he was on a point per game pace in the first 4 games of the 2023-2024 season. I mean, Kaedan Korczak had 1 goal and 3 assists in the first 4 games of him being played. And after 6 games, so I'm talking about the end of October, at the end of those 6 games, it's very fascinating how Kaedan Korczak had 1 goal and 3 assists for the Vegas Golden Knights. But what's also mentioned is that he had a +3, plus minus. He had 4 penalty minutes. And the ice time that he had, I mean, this is a guy in Kaedan Korczak who, like I said, he is a young, up-and-coming guy, only 22 years of age. And we understood that there was a possibility that he would get called up and sent down. He would be really the odd man out for this year. But in his first 6 games of the season that he would play, what I found interesting is that he played around 16 minutes of ice time. He's, third defensive pairing. Okay, that's where his role was with the Vegas Golden Knights. But, I mean, he would put up some hits. He even had some blocked shots as well with the Vegas Golden Knights. And overall, it seemed like Kaedan Korczak was going to build himself up to have a really good season with Vegas. Now, I also have to add this to the context. Zach Whitecloud was dealing with injuries. Alec Martinez was dealing with injuries. So, because of that, it created a window where Kaedan Korczak had an opportunity to earn his opportunities with the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, once Zach Whitecloud recovered from injury, once Alec Martinez recovered from injury, Ben Hutton was going to go a little bit down. Braden Bahal was going to go down in the roster. And that also meant that Kaedan Korczak, who is eligible, when it came to being sent down to Henderson, Kaedan Korczak would be really, not even the 8th defenseman, sometimes even the 9th defenseman on the roster, because you had Martinez, you had Pietrangelo, you had McNabb, you had Theodore, you had Haig, you had Whitecloud, then you had Hutton, then Bahal. So Korczak was just at this point in his career, he's young, he's talented, but he still was at a point where he was not going to be a top 6 defenseman with the Vegas Golden Knights. And this is very valuable. This is very valuable because after the Anaheim game, all right, after the 13th game of the season for the Vegas Golden Knights and his 7th start for Kaedan Korczak, even after having a +4 on the season, Kaedan Korczak would do something interesting where on November 10th, the Vegas Golden Knights, and I'm using Cap Friendly as my reference here, he would get reassigned to Henderson. So after spending essentially around a month on the NHL roster because of the injuries that happened to key defensemen, after a month, he would get sent down to the AHL, and he would be there for about 2.5 weeks. But what's fascinating about that is that he had a 5-game stint in the AHL, but he actually did not do that bad in that 5-game stint with the Henderson Silver Knights. As the AHL.com, and I'm using them as my reference here, he would play against Coachella Valley, a 2-game series against Abbotsford, and then a 2-game series, against the Bakersfield Condors. And he would put up in that 5-game stint 0 goals, 3 assists, but a -3 on the plus-minus side. He also would rack up 8 penalty minutes. So despite only having 4 penalty minutes in his 7 games in the NHL, he would have 8 penalty minutes in 5 with the AHL. And what is interesting to me is that when it came to Kaedan Korczak, he really filled that role defensively with Henderson. You have him, you have Jake Bischoff, you have Dyson Mayo. There's some defensemen there you can watch out there in Henderson. But Kaedan Korczak being there, it seemed like he was going to be in a situation where the Vegas Golden Knights, he was on standby, essentially. He could be in the AHL, he could skate around, be with the organization, but then he would be ready to just get called up at a moment's notice and be in the NHL. And what happened with Kaedan Korczak is that after Thanksgiving, Kaedan Korczak, and I'm using Cap Friendly as my reference here, on November 26th, he would get sent up from Henderson. And I also want to remind people of this. This is when the Shea Theodore injuries were happening. All right, when Shea Theodore went down and he missed considerable amount of time, they called Kaedan Korczak up, and it wasn't just to be a healthy scratch. Kaedan Korczak stepped right in and became an everyday defenseman for the Vegas Golden Knights. And as a matter of fact, from November 27th all the way to December 10th, he played every single day for the Vegas Golden Knights. So how did he do in that 2.5-week stint when he played every day for Vegas? Well, here's what he did. Now, this 8-game stint that he would do for Vegas, he had an assist against the Edmonton Oilers, he had an assist against St. Louis Blues, and he had an assist against the San Jose Sharks. NHL.com is my reference for that. Now, he also had a +3 during this time frame, which is very fascinating when it comes to Kaedan Korczak, because I also want to remind you, his time on ice also went up. I said that he was around 16 minutes in his first 7 games of being in the season. Well, this next 8 games, he would add a minute to his time on ice, and he would play 17 minutes per game with the Vegas Golden Knights. So he was getting more minutes. He was getting more ice time. And a lot of this is because when Shea Theodore got hurt, they put Kaedan Korczak and Brayden McNabb, the trusted, loyal, established veteran, they put him on that same pairing with Kaedan Korczak. We saw that throughout the year. And what's interesting is that during that 8-game stint, he had the same amount of blocked shots as he had hits with the Vegas Golden Knights, which was a very good positive. I mean, he had 20 blocked shots in his first 15 games of the season for Kaedan Korczak. And I'm also going to mention this because it is valuable to say that in the first 15 games of the season, the Vegas Golden Knights scored points in 14 of the 15 games Kaedan Korczak skated on the ice. As a matter of fact, during that 8-game stretch that I'm talking about, they went 5-0-3 with Kaedan Korczak during the 8-game stint, and they won 10 of those 15 games when Kaedan Korczak was there. And in that first 15 games, Kaedan Korczak had that one goal against Dallas, but he had 6 assists. That is a really good thing for a 22-year-old like Kaedan Korczak. The fact that he had just under half a point per game, 7 points in 15 games, and a +7. Like, Kaedan Korczak only had one game up to that point that he had a negative plus-minus for the Vegas Golden Knights. That is very well established. I like that there. And I'm also going to mention this, that when it came to Kaedan Korczak, like I said, he was someone who would play 16.5 to around 17 minutes of ice time every single night. So what would end up changing with Kaedan Korczak? Would he get sent down to the AHL again? No. Unfortunately for Kaedan Korczak, after the Vegas Golden Knights took on the San Jose Sharks and they would win in a shootout, Kaedan Korczak a few days later would be put on IR by the Vegas Golden Knights. He would be diagnosed with a lower body injury, and Kaedan Korczak from December 17th to January 9th would be on the injury reserve list for the Vegas Golden Knights. And this is very important because during this time, defensively, you had Braden Bahal. Defensively, you have Ben Hutton. Like, there were still some people that were coming in and out of the defensive with the Vegas Golden Knights. I also want to remind you that in the month of January, we just experienced Lucas Cormier would make his debut with the Vegas Golden Knights. They'd go out and acquire Tobias Bjornfoot on waivers. Like, during the month of January, it was really fascinating to see the fact that this was a Kaedan Korczak who, while he was injured, the defense just kept going. They would plug people in, plug people out. But on January 9th, when he gets activated from the injured reserve, a lot of people are thinking like, okay, what's going to happen here? Okay, what's going to be the situation? Well, Kaedan Korczak, after getting called off the injured reserve list, he would end up playing 11 games straight for the Vegas Golden Knights. From January 11th all the way to February 8th, Kaedan Korczak would play every single day with the Vegas Golden Knights. And on one hand, this is a very good thing, and I like that we saw this from Kaedan Korczak. The fact that he came off that injury, gets inserted right into the lineup. But how would Kaedan Korczak do in that situation? How did he perform in those 11 games? Well, he would have an assist against the New York Rangers and an assist against the New Jersey Devils. But during that 11-game stint, he only had 2 points. He had a +5, which really, once again, brings up the fact that he did not have a negative plus-minus for all but one game this season. All right, he either had a 0 or he had a plus in almost every game except for one in this season. I also want to mention that Kaedan Korczak, only 4 penalty minutes in those 11 games and only 8 penalty minutes in 26 games. That is incredible for a young guy like Kaedan Korczak. And at the end of those 11-game stints, he also had around 10 blocked shots and around 15 hits. But his time on ice did go down a little bit. They did put him on that, third defensive pairing, second defensive pairing at times. So he only skated around 16 minutes of ice time. Now, for Kaedan Korczak, at the end of February 8th, that would be the end of his NHL run, as after that 26-game stint, where the Vegas Golden Knights, interesting enough, and I do have to mention this, during that 11-game stint that Kaedan Korczak was with the Vegas Golden Knights, they scored points in 9 of those 11 games. As a matter of fact, with Kaedan Korczak, they scored points in 23 of 26 games that Kaedan Korczak was in the starting lineup. And that is really commendable. The fact that 41 points was put on the board with Kaedan Korczak in the lineup, that is a solid effort when you're thinking about, contributions for a 22, then would turn 23 years old in the month of January. So he would end up being 23 years old by the end of the season. But what would his end total be with the Vegas Golden Knights? Well, at the end of those 26 games, he would have that 1 goal against Dallas, would rack up 8 assists for a combined total of 9 points. I'm using Hockey Reference as my reference for this. He also had a +12, which for a part-time guy who's still young, that is impressive. 8 penalty minutes, and he would rack up 17 minutes and 30 seconds of average time on ice. He also had 31 blocks and 43 hits with the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, for Kaedan Korczak, this would be a situation where after that February 8th, he would be called and reassigned to Henderson for the rest of the season. So those 26 games for Vegas, that took place in the first 50 games of the season. He essentially played almost every other game with Vegas, right? 26 games played by the 52 game mark. But he would get sent down to Henderson for the rest of the season, and that's where your attention would be focused with Kaedan Korczak. And we'll talk about what he did in Henderson for the rest of that year. Now, for the end of February, he would play in 4 games for Henderson and would only have 1 assist during that time. That would be a game against San Diego. He also would be in the negative on the plus-minus column for that situation and would rack up 4 penalty minutes. So, interesting enough, he only had 8 penalty minutes during his entire 26 games in the NHL. But go over to the AHL, he already had 12 penalty minutes. So he had more penalty minutes in less games played in the AHL than he did in the NHL. Kind of fascinating there. And then in the month of March, Kaedan Korczak, he would play in 11 games in March for the Henderson Silver Knights. He had a multi-point performance against Abbotsford. That would be on the 8th of March. And then he would have an assist against Abbotsford, and then he would have an assist against Milwaukee. But in the month of March, 3 assists, 1 goal, 4 points in that situation with Kaedan Korczak. And his plus minus was alarming in the AHL. Now, I understand that the AHL statistics are always going to be skewed compared to the NHL, but his plus minus, and it was fascinating to me, is that during that entire time, he had at one point a -6 plus minus during the month of March. Now, he recovered a little bit, and he only had a -2 by the end of March, but it was fascinating how there was about a 4-game stretch where he had a negative plus minus almost every single game with the Vegas Golden Knights. What I also want to mention is that when it came to Kaedan Korczak, man, those penalty minutes were racking up. During the month of March, he ended up having 12 penalty minutes in just the month of March alone. Keep in mind, he only had 8 penalty minutes in 26 NHL games. He had 24 penalty minutes in just a little under 20 AHL games during that time. And then the final month of the season, which would be in April, he would end up having just 1 assist during that time, but he would end up having a situation where he had a +1. So hey, that's positive. A +1 in the plus minus column. And then he would rack up 4 penalty minutes. So 28 penalty minutes for Kaedan Korczak. And what's fascinating is that by the end of April, and when the season's done and wrapped up, Henderson Silver Knights don't make the playoffs. They're not going to make the Calder Cup playoffs with this team. But when you take the side-by-side of Kaedan Korczak and the Vegas Golden Knights, you can actually do this because he played 26 games in the NHL and he played 26 games in the AHL. So I'm going to use the NHL.com and I'm going to use the AHL.com as my reference here. And this is my side-by-side comparison of Kaedan Korczak. Now, once again, same amount of games played here. Now, he had 1 goal in Henderson. He had 1 goal in Vegas. He had 8 assists in Henderson. He had 8 assists in Vegas. He had 9 points in Vegas. He had 9 points in Henderson. So, regardless of how you look at it, Kaedan Korczak this year, he played in 52 games combined between the AHL and the NHL, but his stats in terms of points are the exact same between the NHL and the AHL. So if you combined it, he would have in 52 games played 2 goals, 16 assists, for 18 points in the 23-24 season. Now, what would be different and what would be an interesting thing to point out when it comes to Kaedan Korczak is that Kaedan Korczak, his plus minus was very different between Vegas and Henderson. Now, keep in mind, I said he had a plus 12 with the Vegas Golden Knights, right? He had a plus 12 on the plus minus. He had a negative 5 with Henderson. So if you combined it, he still would be a plus 7. But still, it's very fascinating how he was a positive plus minus in the NHL, but was a negative plus minus in the AHL. Now, penalty minutes is where there's a big difference there. Only 8 penalty minutes in 26 games in the NHL, and he averaged over a penalty minute per game in the AHL with 28 in 26 games. So, if you combined it, 36 penalty minutes in 52 games, I mean, that's something that is interesting, is fascinating. I also want to remind you that outside of Keegan Kolesar, outside of Braden McNabb, you don't really see a lot of guys who have, 30 plus penalty minutes by the end of the year in Vegas. And I also do want to recall the year before, when Kaedan Korczak was a full-time member of the Henderson Silver Knights, he had 60 penalty minutes in 50 games. So is this going to be a pattern to continue in the NHL? We'll have to wait and see. Now, what I'm also going to mention is the time on ice, because when it comes to Kaedan Korczak, it's really interesting how he would play in just around 17 minutes of ice time in the AHL, and he would be around 16 minutes of ice time in the NHL. So even the time on ice was a bit similar when it came to the AHL and the NHL. So where am I going with this? Is Kaedan Korczak ready to be a full-time player in the NHL at age 23? My answer is no. Because they went out and they got Noah Hanifin at the trade deadline. I know Braden Bahal's not here anymore. All right, he's over in Calgary. I know Daniil Miramanoff. He's not here anymore. He's over in Calgary. Alec Martinez, we're going to find out. We're going to find out next week what his future is here. But think about all the defensemen that are still in Vegas right now. So Petrangelo's still here. Noah Hanifin, they locked him up. He's going to be here. Braden McNabb, Shea Theodore, they're going to be free agents the upcoming offseason. Not this one, but the one after. We'll see what happens there. Ben Hutton is still going to be here. Zach Whitecloud is still a young guy. They still have him on the roster. Lucas Cormier, he played, he had his first NHL start just past January. And then you have Kaedan Korczak. And we also want to mention this. Alec Martinez is a free agent. We'll see what happens with him. Do the Vegas Golden Knights go out and sign another defenseman to fill that gap? Nicholas Hague is also still here. Because there's so many defensemen that Vegas has on the roster, as of this point, okay, as of June 20th, I'm going to sit here and say he is not a full-time NHLer, but he's done being in Henderson. I will say confidently that Kaedan Korczak is at a point in his career that he doesn't need to split the AHL and NHL. Now, could he be a scratch in the NHL? Sure. But he is done being a Henderson Silver Knight. I would be very surprised if he suits up for the Silver Knights next year. So that is my angle there, is that Kaedan Korczak is ready to be an NHLer, but he's not ready to be a full-time NHLer. So this was Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rachiele. Hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, have a good one, and go Knights, go.
PR Connections Radio thanks you for watching this podcast. Check out more episodes of this show and our others at prconnectionsradio.com.